All right, so let's talk about split. All right, how many people got to see this? All right, so we're going to discuss, we're good? All right, so where do you want to start? I mean, what would you like to talk about pertaining to M. Night Shyamalan's Split?
James McAvoy is a great actor. Put that out there.
That's where I was going to start as well.
This guy, very polarizing performance for me. Each character that the one character that he played,
Right.
that ended up splitting into multiple personalities. Really got into like the personalities. I was just like, almost believable that these were different people, like, visibly, like to the point where I'm like, yeah, he starts to have different facial expressions, facial features almost, and it's still just James McAvoy.
So I think that's one of the things we probably should address, and that is there are case reports that the personality that splits, takes the light, can be quite different than the index case, in this case, Kevin Crumb. There have been case reports that biomarkers actually change as well, right? So that's something to consider and would be consistent with, albeit an incredible overrepresentation of dissociative identity in Split.
One of his characters, one of the personalities had diabetes, for instance, where the other ones, for the most part, were healthy.
So again, it is consistent with albeit with a rare psychiatric disorder. I can't even guess at the true point prevalence of this illness. So let's analyze, let's discuss Kevin Crumb. What causes DID?
So I think the common theme, and when I was going through these films, the two that connected the most for me were Raising Cain and Split. I thought Split's kind of like almost like a more, to me it was like a more modern, more in-depth look at DID than what Raising Cain presents. And I think kind of a common theme is that childhood trauma is something that kind of creates this, causes this to happen. To me, that's how the movies kind of presented it. And you kind of create this like alternative personality to kind of take the brunt of the emotional trauma, and when something bad happens, that personality comes to light and kind of deals with that emotional stress.
Right. So let's take a little bit of a step back. So a past history significant for trauma, right? So that's the general idea. And of course, the clinician really must investigate childhood trauma. The more severe the trauma, the higher the risk for developing a mental disorder as a result of the trauma. And among the most severe forms of trauma is sexual trauma. Therefore, childhood sexual abuse needs to be investigated for any evaluation of any dissociative state. The most severe form would be DID. So let's talk about that a little bit. There are 3 1/2 dissociative disorders published in the current edition of the DSM. After you rule out medical conditions and/or the effects of a substance, what are those 3 conditions, or 3.5 conditions? We already have one, DID. That's the most severe form. What are the other 2.5?
Derealization, depersonalization.
Right, so it's a condition considered to be the mildest of the group, a condition called depersonalization, derealization disorder. Now, at first glance, the definition of this is rather straightforward. The individual is struggling with either clinically significant depersonalization and or derealization, hence the name of the disorder. Depersonalization is the subjective experience that you are not you, right? There's an unreal aspect of your station. The easiest example of this would be the out-of-body experience. If you've ever had out-of-body experience, you are not mentally ill. But if you've had recurrent out-of-body experiences that impact your functioning, then we have to have that discussion. Similarly, individuals who experience their environment as somehow unreal or detached have derealization, right? Deja vu. Severe recurrent deja vu that impacts the individual clinically with regard to their daily functioning is in the conversation with regard to a mental disorder. Not if you've had an isolated or if you've had experiences of deja vu, right? You're not mentally ill then. Right? So that's depersonalization, derealization disorder. What else? There's one more.
Associative amnesia.
Right. Right. The actual forgetfulness that is not attributed to quote unquote normal aging, dissociative amnesia. Now, dissociative amnesia has a qualifier called fugue, which used to be its own freestanding diagnosis, but is now a specifier. That is, individuals with amnesia that is not attributed to normal aging or forgetfulness may or may not have some seemingly purposeful wandering away from one's home with the assumption of a new identity. If they do, they have dissociative amnesia with fugue. If they don't, they have dissociative amnesia. Right? So there's your point 1.5 potential, right? So there's your 3.5 total dissociative illnesses. The most severe form is DID. On your exam, be careful. If an individual has a subjective experience of themselves being detached in some way from who they are, it may be depersonalization, and therefore it may be in the context of depersonalization, derealization disorder if there is no forgetting. Because if there is forgetting, then it's dissociative amnesia. That is to say, dissociative amnesia may include feelings of depersonalization or derealization for that matter. So be careful. Similarly, it can't be dissociative amnesia if that forgetfulness is part of an individual assuming another personality. Because if there's a distinct personality state that takes over one's conscious awareness, then it's DID. That is to say, DID can include periods of amnesia, and we see this in the movie, right? Clearly see this in the movie, especially when Kevin takes the light.
Yeah,
What happened?
no clue what's going on. It's like, where am I? Who are you?
Exactly right. And we would not be diagnosing Kevin Crumb in that scene with dissociative amnesia as an illness. He has dissociative amnesia as a symptom, but it's a symptom of the larger illness called DID. And similarly, and I think if we asked Kevin, he would endorse the fact that he probably experiences both feelings of depersonalization and derealization, but he's not going to be diagnosed with depersonalization, derealization disorder. You don't make multiple diagnoses when all of that can be described by or can be attributed to DID. Right? So that's something that you're going to have to tease away in the exam. You have to respect that hierarchy. It's always DID. Until proven otherwise. And then it's always dissociative amnesia, with or without fugue, until proven otherwise. And only then, after you rule those two out, would you consider depersonalization, derealization disorder. And by the way, none of the above if due to a substance or a medical condition, right? Like any other mental disorder.
I think that's something very interesting about maybe a patient we've seen on service who expressed some dissociative amnesia symptoms, also a lot of depersonalization, derealization. And he's like, I feel like I'm having out-of-body experiences. I can't even tell if you're really here right now. The room doesn't really, I don't know where I am. He said, in the past, I've had episodes where I don't remember what happened, but people have told me that I was acting bizarre. And, it's very interesting that we're talking about this right now, basically.
Right, and somebody who might be in a med-surg hospital, 900-bed hospital, with a catchment area of Middlesex County plus, would obviously be considered to have an underlying medical condition resulting in maybe the clinical syndrome of delirium that would better describe this than making the diagnosis of DID or any dissociative disorder for that matter. But back to Kevin, DID. And we suspect a significant trauma history. Again, the more severe the trauma, the more likely the risk of developing a future dissociative disorder, including DID. By the way, the more severe the trauma, the less inclined the individual is to remember it. So when you meet a person that tells you, I have no trauma history, I have no history of psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, the clinician must maintain a high clinical index of suspicion nonetheless. Because if there are signs of DID, it's very unlikely that the person will remember that trauma. So be very careful of sticking to the textbook, seeing that line that it's due to a trauma, and then saying, well, without a trauma history, this can't be that diagnosis. The clinical pearl is to maintain that high clinical index of suspicion.
So, quick question: if you have a patient where you suspect one of those 3.5, situations, is it always incumbent on the physician to then try to collect collateral information from family members and friends?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, and the easy answer is yes. And of course, again, the clinical pearl here is that we would treat it very similar to psychosis.
Okay.
Is that collateral information is absolutely necessary here. Absolutely, especially with a trauma history. No doubt. By the way, in all of the above, those 3.5 illnesses, reality testing must remain intact. Because if not, then we have to include the psychotic and related disorders in our differential. Right? In reality testing, whatever that is, that's not necessarily a black or white. It's not a real clear delineation. But the psychotic disorders might be in our differential as well when that gets clouded. But I think for all intents and purposes, for the film, for our fictional case study, reality testing does appear to remain intact. And I'm a little concerned about there being a delusion with regard to what's going on with this strain. But I think for all intents and purposes, for the purposes of our discussion, reality testing is going to remain intact for the alters of Kevin Crump, Dennis, etc.
Right.
What else do you want to talk about with regard to Kevin?
So he lives at the zoo, or works at the zoo, I'm assuming, at one of the altars possibly. And, his altar, who is repeatedly referred to as, he's on his way, he's coming, happens to be this culmination of zoo animals, almost. The beast sort of reflects where he's living. So that environment may play a role in the development of these new personalities that he has, wide variety of personalities. It would be very interesting to find out if, throughout his life, he's been in situations where these personalities have been developed due to his surroundings.
Right. I eventually do want to return to that because there's a timeline here that I think this group needs to build. And I think it has everything to do with what you just said. But before that, remember that I mentioned nothing that's going on with Kevin can be attributable to a substance or underlying medical condition. And the fact that he's in a zoo is a little bit concerning. I don't really think there's much here, but it's something we should briefly discuss, at least to make a teaching point, because there is a substance that is available by veterinarians, people who deal with animals. And I'm just wondering what Kevin's job really is there. Because if he's a vet assistant, he has access to this substance. And this substance is notorious for its dissociative properties because it is a dissociative anesthetic.
Is that a ketamine?
That's ketamine. I mean, it's especially for the beast, which does seem to be a late alter, right? A tardive, a later manifestation. I'm wondering if the first 23 might be due to sexual trauma, but number 24 might be the direct and physiologic effects of a substance, specifically ketamine, a dissociative anesthetic, that is still used by veterinarians. And I'm just wondering what his job there is,
Right.
Because he may have access to it. So that's something to consider. And if not, we at least get to talk about ketamine and the related analog PCP. Hallucinogens, as far as the list of substances go, will be at the top of the clinician's list to investigate when dealing with individuals who are themselves struggling with dissociative states. Hallucinogens has to be top of the list, and that includes cannabis. Right? We're gonna piggyback cannabis onto this as well. The hallucinogens as a chapter, as a class of substances, are usually broken down to 3 subtypes. 1, the dissociatives. Number 2, the psychedelics, that's LSD. And number 3, the deliriants, right? So those are the 3 subclasses of hallucinogens. Again, the dissociatives, that's ketamine, that's PCP. The psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and related substances. And then the deliriants. These are substances, including medications, that have significant anticholinergic and/or antihistamine effects or side effects. Deliriants.
So would that be like tricyclics?
Tricyclics are potential deliriants. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. By the way, do we know you brought this up, so it's fair game to ask, and that does come up on exams. Again, a little bit of a different perspective shift. When we discuss, teach, and talk about the tricyclics as a class, second-line agents in treating major depressive disorder, the best way to kind of learn the drugs as a class is to review the class benefits and side effects, which we'll do outside of this discussion. But then find a fun fact or 2 about each individual agent so that in your mind you can separate them out. All right, so that's something, and we'll talk about that, because there is one that is tricyclic that is notorious with regard to its anticholinergic as well as antihistaminic side effects. Okay, and we'll get to that. Right, we're going to definitely get to that. And it's one that's actually prescribed more by dermatology as a result than by psychiatry. Right, but again, that's in the context of a different conversation. Kevin, what else here?
Well, I mean, I had a question about that. So you said that sexual abuse can cause DID. Can someone doing an sexual abuse activity cause it too? Because like in the movie, it was said that I was inferred that he got in big trouble for, I believe, like touching a girl at the zoo, and he got fired. Or can that have led to a new personality?
Could have, yes. Yeah. Now we're very careful how we tread this, because I don't want to set him up in this specific incident. That is a sexual predator, as making excuses for him either. Right. But he may have dissociated during that time at the aquarium. I believe it was, or it was some kind of a class trip that at least the students were on, and without actually having observed it, without actually having examined Kevin immediately after the incident, we're not going to know. But hypothetically, he may have dissociated during that. Matter of fact, there are some published case studies in which individuals in a dissociative state have done similar things. And these have made the medical literature as a direct effect of a substance. And the substance I'm referring to here are the hypnotics. There are FDA-approved medications that are used for sleep that, as a side effect, can induce these dissociative states. Right? One happens to be Ambien. Right? People who have taken Ambien for sleep not only get the benefits of having a restful sleep, that's been proved through placebo-controlled trials, but it does carry a black box warning. Okay? So does Lunesta, so does Sonata. There are 3. Right? That can induce these dissociative states that people actually have reported after the fact that they've awoken and they've had very complex motor behavior, some of them illegal, some of them driving and ending up in a different town. Not saying that's what happened to Kevin, but it can happen. Yeah. What also could have happened is that he could have been a sexual predator too, and he could have been awake and alert there as well. We don't know. By the way, Ambien/Lunesta/Sonesta induced dissociative episodes, what movie? Fight Club.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Highly suspect that the narrator and his alter, Tyler Durden, is due to the direct and physiologic effect of a substance, that's for a different podcast though.
James McAvoy is also in Fight Club, isn't he?
I was unaware of that.
Or maybe I'm thinking about the guy that played.
I think I'm thinking of Meatloaf.
It's Edward Norton, yeah.
Edward Norton. That's
Oh, it's definitely Edward Norton.
Different actor.
I didn't know if it was part of the larger group.
So something I thought that was interesting about Kevin is that his alters knew about each other, and they knew about each other so much so that one alter pretends to be another one when Kevin visits his therapist or psychiatrist. I'm not sure, but I thought that was really interesting.
So there's a fine line between knowing of an alter and experiencing and encoding the memories of the alter. Again, this is a very rare illness, but in the context of what we know about DID, it is rare that you encode the memories or alters encode the memories when other alters have that conscious awareness. That is not likely to happen. However, what can happen is that you may know of the existence of the alter. Yeah. Right. So there's a difference there. Right. And we see that, I think, portrayed, again, I'll refer when Kevin does get the light towards the end of the movie, he has no recollection of where he is and who Casey is. Anything else here with regard to?
There's a shared theme of trauma in the film in general, between Casey and Kevin. And I believe, that's what ends up saving her life, is that she's different, quote unquote, from other people, unclean or whatever, the point was that the beast was trying to make. But she also experienced childhood trauma. And, they tied that together, making her like the protagonist of the film.
That's right. And during that trauma, which she clearly experienced of a sexual nature at the hands of her uncle, did she dissociate or did her hypothalamus fight or flight?
Fight or flight.
You think? Remember, the hypothalamus really has three functions here. There's actually 5 or 6 that were previously described by Gray. But for purposes of our conversation, fight, flight, freeze. Right? Freeze, of course, is dissociation. What evidence in the film suggests that a young Casey froze?
I think like right when she's asked about it, she kind of just stares blankly instead of giving a definitive answer as to whether she wants to go home or not.
Right, and that could be a residual of a flashback, again, a recurrence of dissociation. All right, and there's other evidence too, and that is that she has scars, doesn't she?
Yes.
Which is indicative of her having cut, which is also indicative of her that is self-mutilating to ground herself to get out of a dissociative episode. So the dissociation that occurred when she was young, when she was that little girl, may have been life-saving. But months to years after, the reoccurrence of it becomes the focus of clinical attention, becomes maladaptive. And during those maladaptive states where she dissociates a year, a decade later, you cut to actually ground yourself and come out of that dissociation. And she clearly has cut, which is very supportive that she dissociated in the first place. So she may have thought that he overwhelmed her. She couldn't flight. She couldn't flee. So, number 3, she froze. She dissociated, which puts her at risk for developing a future dissociative disorder. Which brings us to our next point. Opening scene. Try to remember what that opening scene was as the opening credits roll. What do you see? I always want to take a picture of it, put it up. What do you see? This is called a thematic apperception test, or a TAT, where we put up an ambiguous stimulus and we ask, what do you see? Now there are published TATs. This one's unpublished. Oh,
Was the opening scene
it's not by psychiatry.
in the car? That's the opening scene.
No, it's not.
No?
Before that.
Isn't she out the window, like staring out the window on the phone?
Right, so describe that scene.
Dissociating.
She She might be, right? Who else?
Right, but she could-
We have a person here, seated there, the empty chair phenomenon. We have a person here that didn't see the movie and wants to know, hey, tell me about that opening scene. What do you tell them? Bring it to life for them. You want to conjure up a mental image in their head. Describe it.
So that was a scene where she was with her friends, right?
They're at
They
the
were like-
diner or
yeah.
something.
They're in like so they go to the car.
Oh, no. You jumped the scene.
Oh,
She's just sort of staring out into space at a restaurant in the opening scene of the movie.
Right.
Everybody else is engaging and enjoying, a meal with each other, and she's just not there.
Right.
Almost.
That's right, exactly right. I heard somebody say she's with her friends, and hence why I like to call this a form of the thematic apperception test, because M. Night Shyamalan does not give you that information. That's information you superimposed on the scene,
Right.
right? Which is exactly like the projective test, right? All we know is that she is in a restaurant staring at a window. That's all we know.
Right.
What I submit is that, number one, she was not invited to that party. It is the birthday party of a very popular girl at school.
Well, she was guilt invited. They like talk about it in like the second scene.
In the second scene,
Yeah.
if you take the first scene as her dissociating, part of her daydream, part of her id fantasy wish would have been to be invited.
I see.
Mm.
I see.
And that's what you see.
Like
Maybe she's just at the restaurant eating because she knows the party is there and she wants to be a part of it.
That's right. So then the next question is, if you have a young lady who is staring out the window in a dissociative state, and we begin to have a free flow of consciousness, what might be some of the impulse? Number one, I would really like to be invited to the cool girls party, and then we see it unfold. So what I think we see from that first scene on is really a product of Casey's own mind. What else might someone who has been harmed before, who has been ostracized by the cool clique at school, also wish for?
Them being hurt.
Yeah, that's a very natural id impulse. I wish harm onto them.
Right.
And then, what else?
They end up being harmed in this thought process.
And who survives?
And she survives.
Why does she survive? Because of the very reason that got her sick in the first place, right? My history of trauma becomes my
The
savior.
thing that saved her.
And because they're not like me, because they weren't traumatized, they don't meet with the same outcome. That's the id fantasy. Okay.
If anything, I think you could argue that it switches as well. Suddenly she becomes popular, not because she's that, but she's like, when she says like, pee on yourself, like it works. Like she has this skill set because of her trauma to survive. So the girls find her desirable, they find her a friend in this time. So she almost creates this weird friendship. I mean, he died, but like
Right.
this bond with these girls for that time period.
That's right. So again, what I would submit is that if we were to really see what's going on with Casey, I don't know the actual length of this movie, but it would be an hour and a half of just a young girl staring at a
Sitting
window.
at a restaurant.
Right, which M. Night Shyamalan decided not to do, because I'm not sure if that would have made him much money. But clinically, that would have been much more accurate. So I actually made a video of that, and I posted it on my YouTube channel. So check out what is really going on in M. Night Shyamalan Split, right? Because there's a video up on my YouTube channel that actually shows what really happened.
Wow.
All right?
So, one more thing about Kevin and DID in general. I wonder if so he kind of has this like 24th alter personality, the Beast, and my question is that something that, and I know DID is very rare, is it something that you would expect to see as kind of like this culmination of all of these personalities, or is it just something like a violent state with like a increased physical ability? Is that more so just for Hollywood, just to make the film add an extra twist to it?
Yeah, I think there's an extra twist to this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are case studies that are published that support this idea that there is different physiology that can occur with altered states of consciousness. We know this without any real diagnosis of a mental disorder. There have been women who have their child in a car seat with the car brake failing, who have been able to stop, that 2-ton vehicle. So we know that there is different physiology that can occur in dissociative states, right? And nobody's going to diagnose that mother with a mental disorder, but certainly what she experiences may also be experienced by someone with an established mental disorder called DID, when they're in that altered state, perhaps called the beast. That can happen. Now, to the extent that it happens, and his actually being able to crawl on walls and on ceilings, Hollywood's done their part there to further emphasize that. So it's definitely a symbolic overrepresentation of what has been established in the medical literature. If that makes sense.
Sure.
More evidence, just to support before we leave this idea that Casey is the real patient. And that is, there is a brief moment where we actually see the screen of the computer in that Zoom. And on that screen are multiple files. Everybody know this scene I'm talking about? I think it's one where Casey kind of escapes. She gets into that room, and we see the computer screen. We see the desktop. All those folders have names of the alters. By the way, one of the names happens to be Kevin, suggesting that Kevin himself is an alter and not the index case. And if that is the case, and it does appear that it is, then I think the audience has to ask the question, well, who is the patient? And the answer is,
Wow.
right? So I took a screenshot of it. I will actually post it on my Instagram later today to show you those files. And Kevin is a title.
It's number 4 on the screen. Not number 1.
Right. Do we have number 1 on the screen? Yeah.
Number 1 is Barry, 2 is Jackie, 3 is Orwell, 4 is Kevin.
Got it. Interesting. So I think the other part of this too is that there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as the numbering system is concerned. Only that 1 through 24 does contain Kevin, so who is the real patient? It's Casey. And again, I'll post a video of what really happened on my YouTube channel. Next step. Since it looks like those numbers are rearranged, they're not actually chronological. Let's talk a little bit about Hedwig. Okay, who's Hedwig?
Hedwig's I think it was like a childlike 9-year-old personality that Kevin was one of the split personalities. I found this to be the most fascinating one because the physiological change, I found that to be like more of like a Hollywood exaggeration. But this one seems like, it was just really fascinating to me how it seemed so real and exactly how like a 9-year-old might sound and act. I wonder, is this possible? And I think yes. I think if you have like a person, if you have like had a traumatic moment at that age and that kind of personality just kind of sticks around, I can see how that can kind of manifest itself.
Right.
I was gonna mention, I was gonna ask a question about that. It's like in the movie in Raising Cain and in Split, there's a child personality, like a young boy. So, is that like a form of regression? Could that be like a regressed state, going back to because that's when the abuse happened, when they were young.
Right. So it's a regression on steroids, right? The idea here is that the individual gets fixated to a point where, at that age, during that trauma, they actually go into a dissociative state so that in that state, they can experience the trauma to prevent it being encoded in the memories, in the hippocampus. There's no consolidation. And in the most severe form, there could be an altered personality that actually then develops to experience the trauma so as to protect the individual. In this case, it's either Kevin or Casey, depending on which conspiracy theory you believe,
And
to be spared.
And could that be I guess like the first one, I don't know, I was saying, could that be the first personality? Because in Raising Cain, the boy, I think his name was Josh, he was always like, oh, dad's gonna hurt me. Dad's gonna hurt me. So could that have been the one that first came about, first personality, and that's when they transfer the pain to that one?
Exactly right. And as a branch of psychiatry, a traumatologist will tell you that the age of the youngest alter is the age that the trauma occurred. Which brings up a little bit of a conundrum. In Raising Cain, they get it right. But in Split, it's not accurate because there is a scene that the therapist / psychiatrist asks at what age, and the answer is given as 3. So Hedwig should have been 3. Now, this could have occurred for a couple of reasons. One of which, is simply that M. Night Shyamalan did not consult with a psychiatrist, much less a traumatologist, in informing the script, before he went to production. That could have happened, right? That likely happened. But there's also a different scenario here, and that is
The possibility of another trauma happened at 9 years old, and the fact that these certain alters keep taking life, you'll never see a 3-year-old because the 8, 9-year-old, and then Dennis and Miss, whoever her name was, always take the alter from everybody else anyway.
the 3-year-olds suppressed, right, or repressed, right?
I also think it's fascinating to like on like those two topics, is that Hedwig seems to have the most control and power in a way that like Patricia and LaFord talk about how he gets to choose who's in the light. So whoever controls him controls the light. He's the one that seems to have the most ease with controlling it and being in it and deciding who gets it. He's holding it, he's not holding it. So he seems to have the most influence over being present, which while simultaneously so naive. So it kind of gives this kind of leeway to that idea as well.
Yeah, I agree, it supports that. Right. There's still one other scenario that might be in play here, and that is there could have been a trauma at age of 3, but not one severe enough to have induced or caused an alter, but certainly one that could have gotten the child removed from his home. Ultimately, 6 years later at the age of 9, having been sexually traumatized, resulting in the first alter, who is Hedwig. So that's a timeline we can build as well. That both are correct. The trauma did occur at 3. The patient's report is accurate. However, that trauma at 3 was not severe enough to have caused or induced DID, and that Hedwig was in fact the first alter. The question, though, that has to come up that really kind of is the rate-limiting step to this theory is that then who actually sexually traumatized the 9-year-old if he was removed from his house? Because it wasn't his mother. And I think the answer is in Raising Cain. Hence why I want you to watch the movie. Who sexually traumatized Kevin to cause Hedwig and the other 20+ alters?
Well, in you're implying that the answer is the same as in Raising Cain. So in Raising Cain, the father is the one who traumatizes the boy who grows up to be an adult.
That's a possibility, especially since the father's not written in the script. This may be a pertinent negative. There may be a reason why M. Night didn't write the father into the script, because due to his being a sexual predator, he's in jail.
Okay.
That's a possibility. There's also another one too. In Raising Cain, not only was Carter's perpetrator his father, but his father was also what? What vocation?
The psychiatrist.
And why did a psychiatrist do that to his own child? What was his motivation to do that? Research. Guess what? We have the same exact theme in place in Split, don't we? Whose research is on DID? Who is told by the establishment, don't go there? Who does it anyway at a world conference? Yeah. Matter of fact, when the psychiatrist asks later in the movie, I have a screenshot of this too, I will also post it. At what age? Before the answer of 3 comes up, did you notice the nonverbal reaction of, I think it was Dennis? He's absolutely put off by the question. Did you ever ask yourself the question, why? He scoffs. Certainly, if the psychiatrist is the perpetrator here, just like in Raising Cain, of all people, she would have known. Because she's the one who induced the trauma at age 9 to study DID for her own means, for her own career. And that's clearly a theme here. Right? The other thing that supports this is the very idea that she would have seen her patients in her apartment. Psychiatrists wouldn't do that. Now, there might be some cases where less severe forms of illness, perhaps anxiety states, adjustment disorders, acclimation to school, might receive therapy in a loft that's attached to a home. But boy, there is no case to be made that severe mental illness would be treated in her living room.
Right.
Especially one where there is an alter that is a sexual predator, has a predilection of watching young girls dance naked. You're gonna bring that into your house? And the only reason why she would is that she created it. No, but I mean, it's inconceivable that a physician, a psychiatrist would actually treat that level of severity in the safe space that should be your home.
Right.
So that's another conspiracy theory with regard to, and the very reason why I wanted you to watch Raising Cain, because it's more than just a conspiracy theory, it's actually a plot of another movie. And if you watch that movie as a double feature with Split, boy, does it change how one would perceive M. Night Shyamalan's Split. All right, we'll leave it there. We'll conclude our discussion on Split there.